White sugar. The story of white sugar goes back about 8,000 years and starts with the sugarcane, a giant tropical grass native to Southeast Asia. People didn't have sugar like we do today, so they just chewed the stalks to get the sweet juice for quick energy. Over time, traders carried sugarcane across Southeast Asia, and it eventually spread to places like India and China, where better varieties were developed. Around 350 BC, soldiers of Alexander the Great came across sugarcane in India and described it as the plant that made honey without bees. But the real breakthrough came later during the Gupta dynasty in India, when people figured out how to boil the juice into solid crystals. Early sugar looked more like rough gravel than today's clean white crystals, and even the word for sugar comes from a Sanskrit word meaning grit. By the time sugar made it to Europe through the Arab trade routes in the Middle Ages, it was considered a luxury spice, stored in locked cabinets and used in tiny amounts by the wealthy to show off. A single loaf of sugar could cost more than a day's wages for a laborer. The shift from luxury to commodity happened largely because of the transatlantic slave trade. European colonial powers, particularly Britain, France, Portugal, and Spain, built huge plantation systems in the Caribbean and Brazil, relying on enslaved African labor to cultivate and harvest sugarcane on a massive industrial scale. By the 1700s, sugar had become the most valuable traded commodity in the world, and its price dropped sharply as supply surged. Before modern processing, sugar was sold in hard cones called sugar loaves. These were tough to break, so people had to use tools like hammers or cutters just to get a small piece. That changed in the 1800s thanks to a small accident. In 1841, a woman named Juliana Rad cut her hand while trying to break a sugar loaf. She told her husband, Jacob Christoph Rad, to come up with something safer. He ended up inventing sugar cubes by pressing damp sugar into small blocks. It made sugar much easier to use, and the idea spread around the world. Today, white sugar is almost pure sucrose, made by refining sugarcane or sugar beets until everything else is removed. That's why it tastes clean and neutral, which makes it perfect for baking and cooking. Brown sugar. Brown sugar is essentially white sugar that either never had all its molasses removed or had molasses added back in after refining. Most commercial brown sugar sold in supermarkets today is refined white sugar with a controlled amount of molasses syrup stirred back in. The more artisanal or less processed versions are partially refined, meaning some of the natural molasses was left behind during production. In the early 1900s, companies like Domino Sugar Company ran marketing campaigns to make traditional brown sugar look unsafe. They showed magnified images of harmless microbes in molasses and made them look dangerous, trying to convince people that white sugar was cleaner, purer, and more modern. Over time, this messaging worked, and people started buying a lot more white sugar while traditional brown sugar became less popular. Texturally, brown sugar is noticeably different from white. The molasses content gives it moisture, which makes it clump together and pack into a measuring cup rather than pour freely. That moisture is part of why brown sugar makes cookies chewier than white sugar. The molasses adds hygroscopic properties. It attracts and holds water, which keeps baked goods soft longer and contribute to a dense, chewy texture in things like chocolate chip cookies or gingerbread. The flavor is also deeper. Instead of just sweet, it has notes of caramel and a bit of a rich, almost toasty taste. That's why it works well in cookies, barbecue sauce, or glazed meats. Raw sugar. Raw sugar sits somewhere in the middle between fully refined white sugar and less processed sugars. You'll often see it sold as turbinado, demerara, or muscovado. It's not truly raw because it's still processed, but not as heavily as white sugar. It's usually made by boiling down sugarcane juice and then spinning it in a machine to remove some impurities, while keeping a bit of the natural molasses. That's what gives it its light brown color and extra flavor. The crystals are bigger, harder, and more crunchy compared to regular white sugar. Because of that, they don't dissolve as quickly, which makes them great for sprinkling on top of things like muffins, cookies, or creme brulee. You get a nice crunch instead of it just melting away. In the past, especially in places like the American South, raw sugar was often what smaller plantations produced, because making fully refined white sugar required expensive equipment. It was sometimes seen as a lower grade product, but it had a deeper, more natural flavor. The most widely recognized variety of raw sugar in Western markets is turbinado, named after the turbine centrifuges used to spin off the surface molasses. Demerara is another well-known type, originating from the Demerara region of what is now Guyana. Demerara crystals are large, crunchy, and particularly prized as a finishing sugar. Muscovado is technically a raw or unrefined sugar too, though it retains far more molasses and behaves almost like a very intense brown sugar. Honey. Honey is the only form of sugar in this video that is not produced by human refining, but by the biological labor of bees, specifically the western honeybee, Apis mellifera. It's one of the oldest foods humans have ever consumed. Cave paintings in Spain dating back roughly 8,000 years show figures climbing cliffs to reach wild bee colonies. and ancient Egyptians used it as currency, offered it to gods, and packed it in tombs. When archaeologists opened the tomb of Tutankhamun, they found jars of honey that were still good to eat after about 3,000 years. That's because honey naturally stops bacteria from growing. It has very little water, it's quite acidic, and it produces small amounts of hydrogen peroxide. Together, these make it very hard for microbes to survive, which is why it almost never spoils. Bees collect nectar, bring it to the hive, and turn it into honey using enzymes and evaporation. They repeatedly pass it between each other, breaking sugars down, then fanning it to remove moisture until it becomes a thick, stable syrup. The flavor depends on the flowers the bees visit, so it can be light or floral or dark and strong. Ancient Greeks and Romans used honey in all kinds of foods, from drinks to meat dishes and desserts. In many places around the Mediterranean, it was even called the nectar of the gods and was believed to give strength and wisdom. Texture-wise, most honeys are liquid when fresh, but many types naturally crystallize over time. Honey has also been used as a medicine for thousands of years. Traditions like Ayurveda and Chinese medicine value it for immunity and breathing, and the Egyptians applied it to wounds. Even today, some medical treatments use special honey for healing. Maple syrup. Maple syrup is one of the very few sweeteners that is native to North America and found essentially nowhere else. It comes from the sap of maple trees, primarily the sugar maple, though red maple and black maple are also tapped, and the process of collecting and concentrating that sap into syrup has been practiced by indigenous peoples of the northeastern part of the continent for centuries before European settlers arrived. The seasonal window for tapping maples is narrow and specific. It only works during the transition from winter to spring. The temperature fluctuation creates pressure changes within the tree that cause the sap to flow. The sap itself is watery and faintly sweet. It contains only about 2 to 3% sugar, and it takes roughly 40 liters of sap to produce a single liter of syrup. Everything gets boiled down in large shallow evaporator pans until the water content drops and the sugar concentrates. The boiling process also triggers Maillard reactions and caramelization, which is where the characteristic flavor actually comes from. Maple sap doesn't taste like maple syrup. The flavor is created by heat. The maple syrup grading system now uses a single grade A label with 4 color categories. Golden has a delicate flavor, amber is rich, dark is robust, and very dark is strong. Syrups from early season sap are lighter and sweeter, while those from later sap are darker with deeper, more complex flavors. Canada produces roughly 70 to 80% of the world's maple syrup, with Quebec accounting for the vast majority of that. The province even has a strategic maple syrup reserve, a warehouse holding millions of kilos of syrup as a buffer against bad harvests and price volatility. Back in the day, maple syrup was an important alternative to imported cane sugar, and people would even turn it into maple sugar to make it easier to store and ship. Today, it's a classic part of North American breakfasts, but you can use it in lots of ways. It works in salad dressings, as a glaze for salmon or pork, and in desserts like maple pecan pie. Since it's natural and unrefined, it also has minerals like manganese and zinc, making it a popular choice for people who want something healthier than white sugar. Agave. Agave nectar or agave syrup comes from the agave plant, a succulent native to Mexico and parts of the American Southwest. Indigenous groups like the Aztecs and Mayans used the plant's fibers for rope and clothing, its thorns as needles, and its sap, called aguamiel or honey water, as a drink or a fermented ceremonial beverage called pulque. Agave syrup is made by extracting juice from the agave's core, the piña, and using heat or enzymes to turn its carbs into simple sugars. The result is a thin, mildly sweet liquid with a subtle floral and caramel note that dissolves easily in cold drinks, which helped to become popular in cocktails and health foods during the late 1990s and 2000s health food boom. The syrup is very useful in the kitchen for its neutrality and its ability to blend seamlessly into drinks and dressings. It's sweeter than white sugar by volume, so you need less of it. Coconut sugar. Coconut sugar comes from the sap of the coconut palm. Making coconut sugar is an old tradition in tropical places like Central Java in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka. Farmers climb the palms, cut the flower buds, and collect the sap that drips out. That nectar is then boiled down until most of the liquid evaporates, and the remaining solids are dried into granules or solid blocks. The process is labor-intensive and almost entirely traditional, with most production happening in small-scale operations across Southeast Asia. The final sugar is unrefined, golden brown, and a bit softer and crumblier than regular white sugar. Its flavor is rich, smoky, and caramel-like, not coconutty, and it can change a bit depending on the wood used during boiling. Because it's minimally processed, it keeps small amounts of minerals like iron, zinc, calcium, and potassium, plus some antioxidants. It's also very sustainable, only the flower sap is used, so the trees keep producing coconuts and sap for over 20 years. Coconut sugar is very common in Southeast Asian cooking. It's used in savory dishes like sweet soy sauce and dried meat, and in desserts like clepon and patoleo. Its global popularity comes from being seen as a whole food alternative to white sugar. Corn syrup. Corn syrup is a product of modern industrial chemistry and a defining element of the American food supply. Unlike sugar from plants like sugarcane or maple trees, corn syrup comes from cornstarch, usually from yellow dent corn. Factories use enzymes or acids to break the starch into simple sugars like glucose and maltose. The result is a thick, clear syrup that cooks and food makers really like, because it works in ways regular sugar can't. Corn syrup is useful because it inhibits crystallization. When you're making candy, caramels, toffee, pecan pie filling, or fudge, you need to prevent sugar from suddenly recrystallizing into a grainy texture. Adding corn syrup interferes with that process by introducing different types of sugar molecules that disrupt the formation of crystal lattices. It also adds chewiness and body to confections, helps baked goods retain moisture, and keeps icings and glazes smooth and pliable. Karo syrup, the most recognizable brand in American kitchens, has been in production since 1902. High fructose corn syrup is a related but distinct product, created in the 1970s by processing regular corn syrup further with enzymes that convert some of the glucose into fructose. Because fructose is sweeter than glucose, the result is a cheaper, sweeter liquid that functionally behaves like liquid sugar. HFCS became the dominant sweetener in American soft drinks and processed foods from roughly the 1980s onward, largely because corn subsidies made it significantly cheaper than cane sugar. It became one of the most politically and nutritionally contested food ingredients of the late 20th century. The debates around its health impacts are complex. The chemistry of how fructose is metabolized raises legitimate questions, but the popular narrative that HFCS is uniquely toxic compared to regular sugar isn't well supported by science. The broader issue is overconsumption of added sugars across the board. Even with all the health debates today, corn syrup is still a kitchen helper. Its texture and stability are things other sweeteners can't easily replace. Molasses. Molasses is what gets left behind after sugar has been extracted from sugarcane juice. When the cane is crushed, the juice is boiled and spun into centrifuges to pull out the sucrose crystals. Whatever remains after that spinning process is molasses, a dark viscous liquid full of residual sugars that couldn't be crystallized out, along with a concentrated payload of minerals, trace compounds, and flavor molecules that the refining process removes from white sugar. The quality and intensity of molasses depends on how many extraction passes the cane has gone through. First extraction produces light molasses, which retains more natural sweetness and has a relatively mild, almost caramel-like character. Second extraction yields dark molasses, significantly more bitter and complex. The third pass produces blackstrap molasses, the darkest, thickest, most intensely flavored of the three, with a robust bitterness and an almost medicinal depth. Historically, molasses played an enormous role in the Atlantic economy. In colonial America, it was used to produce rum. Sugarcane molasses was shipped to New England distilleries, converted into rum, and traded back across the Atlantic in the infamous triangular trade. The British Molasses Act of 1733 and the Sugar Act of 1764, which taxed colonial imports of foreign molasses, were among the early economic grievances that contributed to the revolutionary tensions in the American colonies. In culinary terms, molasses is foundational to Boston baked beans, gingerbread, chouflé pie, and barbecue sauces across the American South. In the Great Molasses Flood of 1919 in Boston, a huge tank holding 2.3 million gallons of molasses was burst on a warm January day. The sticky wave, around 15 to 25 feet high, slammed through streets at 35 miles per hour, destroying buildings and even knocking a train off its tracks. 21 people died and 150 were hurt, and it took weeks to clean up. This disaster led to new laws making engineers and architects officially responsible for their building plans. Because molasses concentrates the minerals naturally present in sugarcane, blackstrap molasses in particular is a surprisingly solid source of iron, calcium, potassium, and magnesium. It's not a healthy food in the conventional sense, but it's the one sweetener where the mineral content is actually meaningful enough to notice. Date sugar. Date sugar is different from most sweeteners because it's not a syrup or refined sugar. It's made by drying whole dates and grinding them into a powder that looks like brown sugar. Since nothing is taken out, it keeps all the fiber, vitamins, and minerals from the fruit, like potassium, magnesium, iron, and B vitamins. The fiber also makes it healthier than regular sugar for many people because it's absorbed more slowly and has a lower effect on blood sugar. Dates themselves have been grown in the Middle East and North Africa for at least 6,000 years. Called the bread of the desert, they were so packed with nutrients that travelers could survive for weeks on just dates and water. They're extraordinarily calorie-dense, naturally resistant to spoilage, and can be transformed into pastes, syrups, and other forms with minimal processing. Date syrup and date paste are both common in Middle Eastern and North African cooking to this day. The powdered date sugar sold in Western health food markets is relatively recent, but it builds on that same tradition of dates as a sweetener. Date sugar carries the aromatic richness of the fruit itself, warm, caramel-like, faintly floral, with a subtle nuttiness and hints of vanilla. The biggest difference in cooking is how date sugar behaves. It doesn't dissolve in drinks like coffee or tea, so you'll get a bit of grit at the bottom. It also doesn't melt or caramelize like regular sugar, so it's not good for hard candies or smooth caramel. But it's great as a replacement for brown sugar in baked goods like muffins, cookies, and pancakes. Its rich taste and moisture-absorbing properties really help bake treats. Bakers usually reduce other dry ingredients by about 25% when using date sugar because it soaks up moisture. Malt syrup. Malt syrup, also called barley malt syrup, is a sweetener that's used in both baking and brewing. It's made by soaking barley grains so they start to sprout, then drying them to stop growth. Sprouting turns the grain starches into a sugar called maltose, making a thick, dark syrup. The flavor is grainy and earthy, with a toasty depth and a sweetness that's noticeably milder and more complex than cane sugar. Malt has been intertwined with human food culture for at least 5,000 years, primarily through brewing. Malted barley is the backbone of beer production, and the techniques developed for brewing carried over naturally into baking and sweetening. Malted barley extract was widely used as a sweetener in bread-making cultures long before refined cane sugar became widely accessible. In many Northern European traditions, malt syrup was a standard baking ingredient. Barley malt syrup in particular is still used in bagel production, both in the dough itself and in the boiling water that gives bagels their characteristic crust and chew. It contributes to the deep browning and the slight fermented quality that distinguishes a traditional boiled bagel from everything else. Malted milk, the basis for malted milkshakes and classic diner drinks, is made from a powder of dried malt extract, combined with milk and sometimes wheat flour. Wheat malt syrup tends to be lighter in color and milder in flavor than barley malt. Rice malt syrup is made from fermented cooked rice and has a gentler, more neutral profile than barley malt, which is why it shows up frequently in natural and organic food products as an alternative to corn syrup. Jaggery. Jaggery is one of the oldest unrefined sweeteners still used today. It's made by boiling sugarcane juice or palm sap until the liquid reduces into a thick paste, which is then poured into molds and allowed to cool and solidify. Nothing gets removed or processed out, so it keeps a lot of flavor and minerals that regular sugar doesn't have. In India, where jaggery production and consumption is the highest in the world, it's known as gur and plays a central role not just in cooking, but in cultural and religious life. It's offered during festivals, incorporated in traditional medicine, and even considered a good luck symbol. The taste is richer than white or brown sugar. Sugarcane jaggery has a deep, almost smoky sweetness with notes of toffee, caramel, and a slight earthiness. Palm jaggery made from date palm, coconut palm, or toddy palm sap depending on the region tends to be even more complex, with a richer, sometimes fruity or wine-like quality. The texture of jaggery varies from soft and crumbly to rock hard depending on moisture content and how it was processed. Quality jaggery should be firm but give way easily when pressed, with a color ranging from golden yellow to deep brown. In Indian cooking, jaggery is used in chutneys, lentil dishes, and sweets like chikki, pungal, or payasam. In Bengal, the festival sweet sandesh is often made with date palm jaggery and fresh cheese. In Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and parts of West Africa, palm sugar works the same way. It sweetens but also adds flavor, not just sugarness.